in the lead up to the May election. It sees national security as safe political ground and a potential weak spot for Labor. But the cost of living has dominated the campaign, and the Prime Minister has rejected claims the interest rate hike is going to hurt him on polling day. Recently, the Coalition made a series of major defence announcements, including a $10 billion submarine base to house the future nuclear submarines and a $38 billion expansion of the armed forces between now and 2040. But the new security agreement between China and Solomon Islands has seen the government make a strategic withdrawal on the Khaki Campaign. ABC Defence correspondent Andrew Green looks at how the two parties stack up on national security.
In this so-called Khaki election, the government's putting a lot of emphasis on its defence spending. It's largely a bipartisan commitment, given Labor has pledged to match virtually all of the coalition's promises. The Defence Minister argues that by aiming for military spending to reach 2% of GDP overall, the government's restoring funding cuts by Labor when it was last in office.
When we came into government, spending was at 1.56% of GDP, the lowest level since 1938.
The opposition counters that during the Gillard government, defence spending averaged 7.15% of all government outlays, while in the next financial year it's only tipped to be a fraction over 6%. With the economy growing faster than expected, getting defence spending to reach that 2% of GDP is taking a little longer than expected and not forecast to occur until next year. The coalition's proposing to also grow the ADF by 18,500 uniformed personnel by 2040. And 2 years ago, Scott Morrison outlined $270 billion in overall defence hardware spending over the coming decade. That includes huge investments on future submarines, frigates, armoured vehicles and joint strike fighter aircraft. And since then, Australia has sensationally scrapped its $90 billion French submarine project in favour of an even more expensive nuclear option under the AUKUS partnership.
$5 billion has been spent on subs that haven't produced anything except a torn-up contract.
It's not the only project facing scrutiny. The British-designed $45 billion Hunter-class frigates are running close to 2 years late, and a $1 billion program to acquire American-made armed drones was recently scrapped to help fund the massive Red Spice cyber security package in this year's budget. While Labor's supporting all of the current military programs, it has pledged to conduct a Defence Force posture review if it wins office, meaning some programs could eventually be scaled back or even scrapped.
Well, coming up, we're going to speak to both the Liberal and Labor camps, and we'll hear from you, the voters, as well. First, Andrew Green joins me from Parliament House in Canberra. And Andrew, coming into the campaign, it's fair to say that the coalition saw this as strong ground for them, but where does it sit right now?
You're right. We're more than halfway through the campaign now, and we were expecting that in this bid for another term in office, the government would reflect quite heavily on some of the defence spending that it argues it's restored from record low levels under the Labor administration. But perhaps national security hasn't dominated in the way we were expecting. Earlier, I was certainly getting the impression that the Prime Minister would be doing a lot of defence base visits, particularly even in the north of Australia, where a lot of redevelopment is happening, a lot of upgrades. But it's been this unwelcome development in the Solomon Islands that's put a different characteristic to this Khaki campaign. It's one that's had the government on the back foot, understandably, answering a lot of questions about what more could have been done from Australia's point of view in stopping the signing of this security agreement between Beijing and Honiara, and really has had an area for Labor to attack the government's credentials on national security. Having said that, the Prime Minister's done his best to turn it around and to argue that this hasn't been an overall surprise for Australia, and one that his government has been working very hard to counter behind the scenes, and also through its record levels of defence spending.
Andrew Green, thank you. Well, there are big military bases in Townsville and in Queensland and Rockingham in WA. So which party do voters in these regions in opposite parts of the country think is better at handling national security?
We are not under direct threat right now and not likely to be for many years.
We're in a very fragile time period, so I would not want to change the government right now.
I suppose this place having the big army base makes it a target. Yeah, so maybe it's something to think about.
I just think it's the most important thing in the world today. If you look at what's happening in Ukraine.
Look what's happening just over our waters there with the Chinese buying their way in there. It's a bit scary.
I believe in Labor because Labor's for the man in the street.
The way the defence is going, we're not going to have anything ready for the next 50 years anyhow. So really, it's a moot point.
Well, polling before the election indicated that the government had a strong lead over Labor on national security. I spoke to Liberal Senator Jim Mullen earlier and started by asking him if China's advance into the Pacific means that lead is slipping.
The discussions I've had would indicate that we were considerably ahead on the subject of national security. I think the concentration now that we've moved on to many other things, interest rates, the economy, etc., would indicate that the people have moved along as well. Whether or not the Solomon Islands was of such magnitude that it detracted from the people's trust in our record of many, many years, I doubt it.
Well, it does, though, go to your credibility, though. Is the Beijing-Honiara security deal a damage to credibility?
No, I don't believe there is, and I'm not being silly about that. There are some things which can be done and there are some things which cannot be done. I often get this question and I always follow it up by saying, well, what do you think we should have done? And that's the difficult issue. We had the heads of our intelligence go across to the Solomon Islands. We had phone calls between various emissaries. We sent an assistant minister across. But the basis of it all really is that the Solomon Islands is an independent country. Are those that say that we've done something wrong, are they saying that we should have occupied the country? Should we have threatened the country? Well, no, we don't do those things. Are they saying that we should have got a whole bunch of money and gone across and done what the Chinese do and then bribed our way into the country? Because we are certainly providing a significant amount of financial support because we are all part of the family, as the PM says.
Well, there have been red lines drawn about Solomon Islands, though, and we've also heard from Peter Dutton talking about preparation for war potentially involving China. Is that wise? Is that necessary during an election campaign to use that sort of language?
I don't know whether it's necessary during an election campaign, but it's very, very necessary now. And we just happen to be having an election campaign during a time when our strategic environment has deteriorated in a way that given how old I am, I've never seen in my life before. This is an extraordinary different environment that we are facing now. And if we're not preparing for war, then what are we doing? You know, it's just that in the past we've been reluctant to say it. I think it's a statement that absolutely every Australian should take and every Australian should think about. You might have heard the Prime Minister's the Prime Minister's speech on Anzac Day, where he said that it takes a nation to defend a nation. Now, that's critically important. It's a very, very wise observation. And Stan, you may even have noticed that he was quoting me when he said that. So it's particularly wise. It takes a nation to defend a nation. And therefore, we should always be prepared. The national security, the national security of this nation is not something which is looked after by diplomats or by the Defence Force. It is the responsibility of every person. I was greatly relieved to hear that we are now talking about preparing for war.
That's the criticism, though, isn't it? We may be preparing for war, but we are not prepared. How is this rhetoric helpful?
Well, I think that it's got to start with a discussion of what kind of war we might be preparing for. And that's the natural extension of what Peter Dutton said. So Peter said, we've got to prepare for war. The next question, of course, is, OK, well, what war are we preparing for? Are we preparing for an Australia versus China war, or are we preparing, which is my view, the more likely scenario is a regional war between China and the United States, in which we might be collateral damage. So until you get down to the specifics, the generalities of, well, are you prepared or are you preparing? Of course we should have started this 20 years ago. But we didn't start this 20 years ago, and that's a key factor. What we've got to do now, as fast as possible, is increase what makes us a strong nation. And what makes us a strong nation is to be economically strong, financially strong, diplomatically strong, and militarily strong. In some of those, we're doing okay. In others, we're not doing so well.
So what then is the prospect of conflict with China? If Xi Jinping uses force to unify Taiwan, would we go to Taiwan's defence?
We're very much likely to be collateral damage, and we have got to very strongly prepare for the kind of collateral damage in the first instance. But this is a bit like, and until, Stan, we actually start to look at the specifics, because I would say, and American generals say, that China could beat the United States in our region very, very quickly. They conduct war game after war game after war game. And in their crude terms, they say in each of these war games, we get our arse handed to us. So this is, and they've been asking Congress for money. They've got some of that money now. But their bases in Guam, in China, Guam, in South Korea and in Japan are terribly, terribly vulnerable. So it doesn't become an issue of should Australia join in a war with China against the United States. Mate, it might be over by the time we notice it. China has the capacity to smash us and to smash the West in space, by cyber, by missile attacks on various bases, and also on and then to solidify so that any American counter thrust could be well and truly stopped. This is what American generals are saying from their own war games that they're conducting.
Senator Jim Mullen there with that very blunt assessment of what war with China could look like. So Labor says the government's rhetoric on China has left the nation exposed to foreign threats. I spoke to the party's Shadow Defence Minister, Brendan O'Connor, earlier. I started by asking him how he feels about the coalition's track record on defence.
Look, I think there's been some significant national security decisions by the government that are questionable, some significant foreign policy missteps by the government. So really it's their record that they're looking to run on, and unfortunately they haven't acquitted themselves well in the area of national security, in my view.
Yeah, you talk about the government's record though, but Labor has supported the government's positions. Defence update, increased spending, AUKUS nuclear-powered submarines. So you've tried to remove any difference, haven't you, between the parties at all when it comes to defence?
Well, I really do believe the opposition's role when dealing with a government making big national security decisions is to support the government of the day in the national interest. When you agree, and we fundamentally agree with the AUKUS proposition, the re-enlivening of the Quad, the increased investment and expenditure. However, we don't believe the fallout with the French was well handled. We don't believe that the investment and expenditure has led to the defence assets and the capability we require. So it's the implementation of some of these things we are concerned about, and for that reason we'll make that clear. That's our job as an opposition, yes, to agree with the government on big issues when it comes to defending this nation. However, holding them to account for delivering assets or for their foreign policy missteps. I think the people of Australia expect us to do that.
But the criticism of you, though, is that you were inconsistent last time you were in office, and that raises questions, does it not?
Things have changed since we were last in government. I mean, since we were last in government, you know, even a year after, Tony Abbott was inviting President Xi Jinping to address the Parliament. So a lot has changed in that time. We agree with the increase in defence expenditure, the $270 billion on defence acquisition, the $575 billion over the decade in toto. We need to do that because things have changed. China's behaviour has changed. We agree with the government's more assertive, more aggressive, more coercive, and we've had to respond.
Regardless of what we spend, though, the fact is we'll be outpowered and outspent by China when it comes to military. What could you possibly do to wind back Chinese assertiveness in the region? How could Labor have headed off the Pacific Island nations like Solomon's, making their own sovereign decisions when it comes to national security?
What we would say is we've been historically their partner of choice, well before even the Second World War. We want to try and reassert that position. We want to make sure we remind them that we're their friends, not just their neighbours, that we've got mutual interests. And I think one of the ways to do that, Stan, is to, like the announcement Penny Wong and I and others recently made about increasing our investment in the Pacific, increasing development aid, increasing our voice by, adding to the broadcasting capacity in the region, spending more money on aerial surveillance to protect the exclusive economic zones of those Pacific Island countries. So, in other words, work on transnational crime matters together. Spend more money on military training of Pacific Island Defence Forces and working with them more closely. So there's a combination of whole of government things you can do to reinforce and strengthen our relationships and hopefully reverse the concerns we've had about what's happening most recently in the Solomon Islands.
Look at defence expenditure and assets and the commitment to develop nuclear-powered subs. That's decades away. What do you do to expedite that? What do we look at in the short term? Is it leasing? What does short-term outlook in terms of expenditure look like?
Well, as I say, revenue. Well, if you remember the time I was sitting on the National Security Committee of Cabinet and the Expenditure Review Committee, and I can just assure you that, we were struggling with a global recession after the GFC. Revenue was falling, commodity prices were falling. We were trying to make sure we were responsible and economically, and so there were some reductions, but overall, on average, and that's when you look at the defence expenditure, pulling out 1 year doesn't work. The contracts go for 30 years, 20 years, sometimes less and sometimes more, but you do have to look on average. And if you look at the Howard years, they spent less per annum than the Hawke years, but overall, the things have changed. The risk assessments changed. The 2020 strategic update, as you know, Stan, has changed the notice warning time of a serious conflict. So we've had to change with it. And whilst people want to pretend that what's happening today was what was happening then, that's not the case. So we support the government on defence expenditure, but not on their capacity to deliver the assets. We've had terrible blowouts in frigates. We've spent $5,500 million on a submarine contract that didn't even amount to one submarine.
Now, Peter Dutton says we should prepare for war. Xi Jinping has been threatening to take Taiwan by force. Do you concede here that Peter Dutton is right in this warning about potential conflict?
Well, I think we need to prepare to defend this nation, but probably say less and do more. I think Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. Peter Dutton seems to turn that maxim on its head. I think it's no point talking up and using elevated rhetoric if you're not delivering the assets that will deter conflict. So talk less, do more, focus on delivering the assets we need in the short, medium and long term.
Well, former Submariner and now independent South Australian Senator Rex Patrick joins me now from Port Lincoln. It's good to have you with us. I want to come to submarines and defence expenditure in a minute, but we heard a very frank assessment from Jim Mullen a little bit earlier about what war with China would look like, and frankly saying China could win win very quickly against the United States. Would that be your understanding?
Oh, look, I don't think it is as it was many years ago, where unquestionably the United States would win a conflict. That circumstance has changed. We've seen the Chinese Navy, for example, go from a Navy that operated in the South China Sea to a Navy that now regularly sits off the coast of Queensland watching our major exercises, a Navy that transits through the Arafura Sea as one did in January this year, and lit up a RAAF aircraft with a laser. Their defence forces have matured. They are getting depth to their defence capability, and it is a concern. Look, Henry Kissinger once said it would be surprising if a country that grew to a significant economic status in the world didn't have a strong military. So it's not surprising. I think that the dynamics have changed, and there would be questions as to the ability of the United States to properly defend Taiwan.
That then goes, of course, to our AUKUS deal, nuclear-powered submarines, which are decades away. Given that potential conflict could be in 5 to 10 years, some have speculated, or even sooner, what do we do in that case? We can't be looking decades from now, can we?
Sure. The AUKUS arrangement for submarines is a huge mistake, and Labor are wrong to stand by it. There are 3 problems associated with the AUKUS submarine deal. The first is, as you have identified, that a submarine won't be delivered until 2040. That's 18 years away. Having a nuclear submarine turn up is like trying to have a perfect football team turn up after the grand final. It is too late. The only way a nuclear AUKUS submarine will help us is if it's got a time machine in the back of it. The second problem with it is that the cost estimate from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute takes the price up to something of the order of $170 billion. That's a bankrupting number. It's a number that, when you've got a finite defence budget, will take expenditure away from other much-needed capability. It's too expensive. The third problem we've got is, as the government tries to reduce the schedule risk to bring a delivery back earlier than 2014, we'll end up in a situation where, in reducing that risk, the job will go offshore. And that means we'll export $170 billion worth of Australian taxpayers' money to foreign shipyards for foreign jobs.
It still, though, brings us back to the reality that you outlined before, and that is that China is stealing a march here, getting an advantage, strengthening their military. We may be in a situation of conflict. So given that you say that's too far away and too expensive, what does Australia do?
Well, Australia needs to stop taking on the view that it is special in some way, and going to, as Mr Kinnaird and Mr Mortar recommended in 2 separate reviews to the Department of Defence, moving towards more off-the-shelf solutions. In the case of the submarines, we could actually have a highly capable off-the-shelf design built in Adelaide and then improved in Australia, and that construction could start in 2 years' time for delivery of a submarine in 2 to 3 years' time, remembering that we went from a greenfield site in Adelaide for the Collins-class submarines to 6 years later having our first submarine. That sort of program, we would be able to get something of the order of 15 to 20 highly capable submarines for around about $20 billion. And we can do that here, and again, then use Australian industry to make improvements to those submarines. And I've been to sea on German Type 214 class submarines, both the South Korean Navy and the Greek Navy. I've been to sea on very small Norwegian submarines. And of course, I have been to sea on nuclear-powered submarines. So I do know the difference. Defence always seems to want the riskiest and most costly solution, and someone has to put up their hand and say, sorry, we've got a real situation developing and we need a pragmatic solution.
Rex Patrick, good to have you on the program. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Thank you very much.
So while the Prime Minister and opposition leaders spar over who has the more effective position on China, voter attitudes suggest Australians support a stronger line on Beijing and more investment in foreign aid and defence spending. Let's bring in data analyst Casey Briggs now. Casey, when you look at the Solomons issue and the handling of that, what's polling telling us about who has the better outcome on this? Who's best positioned to handle it?
It's some really interesting numbers we're seeing, Stan. You know, parties want to set up these election contests on the terms that they think they'll do well on. The government obviously was building pillars around the cost of living and the economy and foreign policy and defence issues. Both of those issues have seen a shift in the terms of that debate, if you like, during the campaign. Obviously, a higher than expected inflation rate rise leading to some interest rate rise, one and another one expected, has changed the economic debate. But on foreign policy, this news from the Solomon Islands has really shaken up that aspect of the campaign, as you were reflecting on earlier. And I want to take you to some numbers that suggest perhaps the electoral contest here is a bit more competitive than traditionally you might have thought. This is polling from Essential Media, released this week, a sample size of about 1,500 people, a margin of error at 2.5%. And people were asked, which political party do you trust more to manage the relationship between China and the Solomon Islands? More people saying Labor than the coalition. Of course, a lot of people sitting in the middle saying there's no real difference between the parties on these issues. But this is obviously an issue. These are topics that the government thought coming into this election. I think traditionally a lot of commentators thought the coalition would have the edge on. That doesn't seem to be the case this time around.
How much is it weighing on voters' minds, or how important is this particular issue?
I think that's another key point here, is that this, while it's an important issue in a lot of voters' eyes, it's not the most important issue in this campaign. In the same Essential poll that we were just talking about, they asked basically a series of issues. How important are these issues? And have a look at these figures. The cost of living was the most important issue. 79% of people saying it's very important or important. Improving public services like health and welfare, also ranking very highly job security and climate change. And that's broadly consistent with other polling that we've seen through this election campaign. The relationship between China and the Solomon Islands, 46% of people saying, yes, that's important or very important, but it is a lower order issue than many of these other ones. So that is maybe some, in terms of the brutal electoral maths of it all, maybe some comfort for the government here that maybe this one won't factor so much into their decisions.
Casey Briggs, thank you for that. Well, China has hit back at speculation Beijing will establish a military base in Solomon Islands after Prime Minister Morrison claimed it would be a red line for Australia. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson called it pure disinformation. Joining me now from Shanghai is Chen Hong, the Director of the Australian Studies Centre at East China Normal University. Chen Hong, good to have you with us. Why should Australia not suspect that China does intend to establish a military presence in Solomon Islands?
Well, because first of all, the agreement is simply about, the social, stability. Because actually, there's no military nature as contained in the agreement. The agreement was in response to the social unrest resulting in violence in Honiara last year. So that is actually a way to curb possible potential, social unrest that could happen, targeting at Chinese businesses and Chinese families.
But that's
that is actually the fact.
That's as it stands now. But what about in the future? What's to say that China would not like to establish a base? I mean, we look at the South China Sea, for instance. There was an international maritime court ruling that China not claim and militarise the disputed islands of the South China Sea. And China went ahead and did that. So you're saying now, no plans for a base. That doesn't say it's not going to happen in the future, though, does it?
Well, I don't think actually statesmen should be making decisions upon conjectures. For example, like earlier this year, Australia and Japan, signed the IAA, the reciprocal, access agreements, which enables Australia to deploy military personnel, that is to say, army personnel, and also military equipment, that is to say, weaponry, in Japan, which is actually 1,800 miles from China. So China didn't make a fuss about that. China didn't say, okay, Australia is ready to attack China. Because actually, as two sovereign nations, two sovereign countries, Australia and Japan have all right to enter into any deals they like, as long as that is not targeting at a third party. So likewise, China's agreement with Solomon Islands is also agreements between two sovereign nations, and actually, both the Prime Minister Solomon and also the Chinese Foreign Ministry expressly, indicated that actually there's no indication that actually the agreement would lead to a military, military base. That is actually, the stance we have been having.
The difference here is that this has traditionally been seen as a sphere of influence for Australia, and particularly the United States. And that's why we're hearing this talk of red lines. That's why we're seeing the concern from the United States. China has said it seeks to be the preponderant power of the region. It's building its military. Given that context, why shouldn't there be greater concern, caution, suspicion, even fear about what may happen?
Well, I don't think actually China agrees that there should be a sphere of influence or backyard for any country. I think actually Prime Minister Submarine also repudiated this actual idea about regarding the South Pacific as Australia's backyard, as backyard is simply designed for dumping, rubbish. So this is actually,
it is Australia's region.
really
Australia is a
fact,
Pacific
actually,
country. Australia shares that space with Pacific Islands.
Solomon Islands and also Pacific Island nations, their feelings and respect them, accordingly.
Let's look at what Xi Jinping has said about Taiwan. And again, this adds to the concern at the moment because we've seen an increase in military exercises against Taiwan, both in their scope, their intensity, their size. We've heard time and time again Xi Jinping say that China reserves the right to take Taiwan by force if necessary to reunify Taiwan. That potentially puts China and the United States on opposite sides, potentially dragging Australia into a conflict as well. That also goes to the level of concern right now, doesn't it?
I think actually everybody, every nation, almost every nation in the world agrees that there's only one China. And, the government in Beijing represents the whole China and Taiwan as a part of China.
That doesn't authorise force, though, or talk of force, does it?
Part of the agreement that, as expressly indicated in the communique, which actually consolidates the bilateral relations, diplomatic relations between China and Australia and China and the United States. And also, I think actually you used a very good word. You said reunification, in other words, China and Taiwan.
Well, that's the language that's the language Xi Jinping uses.
One part of this is what we have been saying. This is China's stance. We believe actually, China is actually, the sovereign country, a sovereign country, and to ensure the territorial integrity of the Chinese, sovereignty, that's actually, definitely China would resort to any means to ensure the territorial integrity of our country.
Chen Hong, is China preparing for an eventual conflict, or what they see as potentially eventual conflict with the United States?
I think China never, draws a red line with the United States or with Australia. Well, Peter Dutton has been threatening war with China. Well, drumming, the beating of the drums of war. But China never threatens war with any country.
But Xi Jinping does talk about using force against Taiwan and is building is building the military. So what is he building the military for and arming it for and building that power for, if not the potential of a conflict?
Well, of course. Australia is actually arming itself with a fleet of nuclear-powered submarine. Australia is also talking about, the manufacturing and deploying of sovereign missiles. So what is Australia doing? Trying to prepare war with what country? If anybody can answer me this question.
Chen Hong, just a final thought from you. We've seen relations between Australia and China deteriorate, relations with China and the United States deteriorate. What are the diplomatic options here? What is the pathway forward to resume diplomatic relations, build on those diplomatic relations to avert the potential for conflict?
Well, I think actually everybody in China, feels, sad about the deterioration of the bilateral relations between China and Australia. And we hope that actually the bilateral relations would, improve. I think actually the most important thing is actually respect. So if actually Australia constantly threatens war with China, constantly calls names, insulting in an insulting way, I think actually this is not a constructive way of making improvements with China or with any country.
Chen Hong, good to have you on the program. Thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you very much, Stan. Thank you.
Now, Lavina Lee is a senior lecturer in the Department of Modern History. Mick Ryan is a retired Major General in the Australian Army, and they join me now. Mick Ryan, I'll start with you and just go back to what we heard from Jim Mullen, a very frank assessment of what conflict with China would look like, that China is upending the status quo and, in his words, could inflict a defeat on the United States very quickly. Do you share that view?
Well, I certainly share Jim's view that China is upending the status quo, and they have built a very powerful military over the last 30 years. But remember, the United States military is an enormously powerful one, and in the Pacific alone, its navy has really no peer, regardless of the size of the Chinese navy. The US Navy is very powerful, and I remain optimistic that the US military can hold its own, particularly in the Western Pacific.
And yet we saw that same military leaving Afghanistan, of course the return of the Taliban. There were the previous wars in Vietnam, wars in Korea, where that overwhelming force was not necessarily successful. So again, if we're looking at increasing Chinese power and the US trying to maintain its presence here, what would that conflict look like? And what would the US have to do to be able to regain, or you may think retain, that strategic and military advantage?
Well, I think any conflict that's initiated by China will feature large-scale use of cyber forces, large-scale use of medium and long-range missiles, as well as the new Navy that they've built and their Air Force. But remember, the United States also has these kind of capabilities, and they have vastly more experience in integrating these different domains in warfare. We should not underestimate or write off US capacity in the Pacific.
Lavina Lee, what does that mean for the choices Australia is making right now? I mean, we're clearly, with the AUKUS deal, getting into the nuclear-powered submarines, the Quad arrangement as well, increasing our military. But what does the next 5 to 10 years look like for Australia when it comes to security?
Look, you can see already with our Defence Strategic Update last year that Australia is preparing itself for the possibility that we might have to join the United States in a conflict over Taiwan. And the Defence Strategic Update is looking at not only the possibility of integrating nuclear forces and better submarine forces. As we know, those submarine forces are not due to come online for quite a long time. But the AUKUS deal has a more immediate impact in the 3 to 5 year range, where we're partnering with the UK and the United States to enhance our capabilities in that short-term period. So we've just mentioned cyber capabilities, but really high-tech weaponry is what we're after, and the ability to conduct long-range strike capabilities to deter any attacks on Australia from a longer range.
It goes to that question of preparedness, and Peter Dutton was just last week saying, you know, to preserve peace, you prepare for war. It immediately raises the question, how prepared are we? How prepared are we right now?
Look, I think, there are commentators out there in the media always calling for us to spend more money. And I do think...
Which we are doing.
Which we are doing, but I think we need to obviously spend smarter. There's a limit to how much you can spend. We're already spending or committing quite a large amount of defence dollars going forward in the next 10 years. So we are going to meet our commitment to spend more than 2% of our GDP on defence. I don't think it's about the amount of money. It's about targeting more immediate, a bang for your buck in the next 3 to 5 years. And I think that's what Peter Dutton's talking about, accelerating to a war footing, is that it has to be more urgent.
Mick Ryan, what does preparedness look like? And is there a sense that Australians are becoming more aware that this is something that may be imminent and we need to make hard decisions about this?
Well, preparedness doesn't look like soldiers carrying bags at quarantine hotels, to be quite frank. The ADF has a lot of recovery to do from the last 2 years of support to state governments, as necessary as they were. And to be frank, in the future, it's not going to be able to do all those commitments to domestic society as well as prepare for potential conflict. It's probably going to have to grow, and it's going to have to do a lot more training with the Americans and Japanese and others, just to ensure that we look to the Chinese that we're not the kind of country you want to take on, and that the deterrence effect that's described in the Defence Strategic Update is realised.
Are we late to this? We're talking about this now. If we go back to 2009, Kevin Rudd, in his defence white paper, is increasing defence spending, warning back then of China and what the risk or challenge or threat it might represent. Have we lost a decade?
Well, one of the great joys of being in a democracy, Stan, is that sometimes we don't get these kind of calls right. I'd rather be in that kind of system, but it's not too late. There's still a lot we can do. I think, as your previous speaker has said, it might be a matter of spending a bit more, but it's certainly a matter of spending a lot smarter than what we currently are.
Lavina, what sort of a wake-up was it when Solomon Islands announces a deal, a security pact with China?
Well, I think this has been some time coming. So in a sense, I don't think it's necessarily a surprise that it's happened. I think there were warning signs that this was on the cards for at least 3 years, if not longer. So China has been knocking on the door of countries like Vanuatu, Fiji, PNG for quite a long time. So I think it is a wake-up call in the sense that we now have for the first time the potential for a hostile power within 1,600 kilometres to 2,000 kilometres of our shores, and we haven't faced that since World War II. So it certainly tells us that we need to be very cognizant of the other countries in the Pacific and the vulnerabilities that they might face in terms of Chinese influence and the potential there.
If it wasn't a wake-up or shouldn't have come as a surprise, what were we doing wrong that Solomons would take that step?
Look, obviously in the Solomons case, you've seen a bit of reporting coming out already, and I think it can be said that I think it's based on sound intelligence. I've read reports, credible reports, that in the recent no confidence vote against Submarine, China provided him with some funding, which he then passed on to all of those politicians who thought to vote against him, in the tune to about $30,000 each. So what we're dealing with is not so much, I think, a misapprehension about the value that Australia plays and the value that Australia has to the people of the Solomon Islands, but I think perhaps there's a bit of a failure of diplomacy in terms of understanding the mindset of Submarine and just how far our persuasiveness was actually getting. I think we're really dealing with a hostile actor in the Solomons, the leader of the country. I think it's very difficult to convince him otherwise, and now we've got to move to a footing where we need to, I dare say, apply more sticks as opposed to carrots to him personally, to try and deter him from taking the next step and actually activating that. Look, I think that the fact is that Solomons is still a democracy, so there is still a potential for more, strategic use of intelligence to either support the opposition parties or to undermine his position within the population.
But Mick Ryan, China is saying that it does not intend to build a military base in Solomons. We've heard the same thing from Sogabare. That's not part of the deal. But how do you read that? Is that an intention? Is that a longer-term view? Why would China seek that?
Well, China said the same thing to President Obama about militarising islands in the South China Sea, and we all know how that went. So we really can't take China at face value when it says these kind of things. And to be frank, this agreement remains secret. Even the people of the Solomon Islands haven't seen the full details of this agreement. I think when we'll see it, it won't be very pleasant reading. We should expect the Chinese will use the Solomon Islands for everything it can to collect intelligence against Australia and potentially as a base in the future.
Only about 30 seconds, but what does Australia do then to head that off? What does a red line look like?
Well, use of red line is probably not the most appropriate phraseology here, but certainly Australia needs to make it very unattractive for the PLA and other Chinese services to operate in the South Pacific. We need long-range strike weapons, we need a larger navy and an enhanced naval and air presence.
Mick Ryan, good to have you with us. Lavina Lee, thank you again for giving us your time as well.
Thank you.
And that's our program for now. Of course, you'll continue to watch coverage of the election here or the election campaign here on the ABC, and continued discussion around defence, foreign affairs and security as well. I'm Stan Grant. Thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.